Game review. My name is Caleb Denby, and welcome back to Game Review. It probably has not been too long since you last have seen a game review on the YouTube channel, but for me, it's been months since I recorded one of these. So in those months, I did not come up with any new clapping ideas, so please give me all of your suggestions down in those comments below, and I will hopefully be struck with inspiration. In the meantime, I do have a game for us to review today. This is a game from the Clutch Chess Tournament going on that was between Fabiano Caruana and Leinier Dominguez. Of course, after the first day of Clutch Chess, Fabiano Caruana had a crushing lead over Leinier Dominguez, and I wanted to take a look at one of those games that went really well for him. So let's jump in here. Fabi plays one, knight f3, we have d5, and then Fabi goes for g3 rather than making an immediate claim in the center. No c4 readies, no d4 transpositions. He's playing knight f3, knight f3, g3, going for these types of system setups, the King's Indian attack system, where you just kind of develop your pieces on the king side, you allow black to choose what setup he wants to choose, and then you're going to decide how to play against it. In this game, Leinier chose to play the move c5, which is actually one of the more ambitious tries, I believe, against this setup. It is possible for black to just play normal moves like knight f6, even c6, and this is a slightly more conservative way to play, just making your strong point on d5 here. You just kind of build a big triangle with your pawns, support this pawn on d5, and then from there, you just develop your pieces. With c5, obviously, this move gives up a little bit of control over the d5 square, but in return, you get control over the d4 square. And we'll see that becomes really relevant later on. So Fabi just plays bishop g2. We have e6 from Leinier. This pawn does need some support. Fabi castles. We have knight f6, c4. And now we see Fabi trying to break down these light squares. And with this move c5, Leinier kind of telegraphed what he's going to do here. He pushes d4. Taking as much central space as possible, and that's why I think this c5 line is one of the more combative lines for black. Now, after the move e3, we have knight c6, e takes d4, c takes d4, and d3. And many of you might be used to seeing this kind of position from the other side, with colors reversed. This, of course, is a reversed Benoni style of position here. You have black, in this case, being the one with the strong central pawns, and you have white with this fianchettoed bishop, with this d3 c4 structure, with this half-open e-file, and looking for play on the queen side perhaps. So what is the point in playing a reversed opening like this? Well, obviously, when you have the white pieces, you have the benefit of having an extra tempo, right? And so it's all about, is that extra tempo going to be useful? And in the case of the Benoni, I really do think it is a very useful tempo. So it makes sense to play the reversed Benoni. With this extra tempo, white can actually prevent a lot of the problems that kind of plague the Benoni. For example, moves like bishop f5 are never going to be possible, whereas bishop f4 lines against the Benoni are very, very testing. Also, white has plenty of time, as we see after bishop d6, to immediately just play this move bishop g5, and he's getting a lot of these minor piece trades that black generally has to work very, very hard to achieve in the Benoni. And when you play it with white, it does come a little bit more naturally, a little bit more easily, because you do have this extra tempo, and black is kind of on the back foot trying to defend this center from the get-go. Okay, bishop g5, we have h6 now. Bishop takes f6, queen takes f6. Of course, white is usually happy to trade off this bishop in this opening. In Benoni structures, you generally have just one too many pieces for the number of squares you have. For example, if this bishop comes to d2, that's a good square for the bishop, supporting the pawn push b4, but then all of a sudden, your knight can't go to d2. And so by trading off one piece, it allows the white pieces a little bit more freedom to get where they need to go. So now we do see this knight come out to d2, and in this case, it's not leaving behind a bishop on c1 because we already got rid of it. Queen e7 now from black is stepping out of this knight e4 move, and now a3 by white. Obviously, in the Benoni, black generally plays for a6, b5, and the reverse Benoni, white is playing for a3, b4 as well. A very common plan. Is it is in black's best interest not to allow this to come through. For example, if you just place some nothing move like castles, well, now b4 is already going to be causing you quite a lot of trouble. b4, c5, and all of a sudden, you'll see this would be a version of what white got in the game, but it would be a much better version, and we'll see why in just a few moments. So after a3, black plays a5, and this is the standard way of stopping b4. Now rook e1 comes on the board from white. Black goes ahead and gets castled, and now white plays a really interesting move here. It's the move rook c1, and the idea is what you see on your board right there. He wants to push this pawn up to c5. Black successfully, for the moment, stopped white from playing b4. He kind of placed all of his pieces with this purpose to stop b4. And so what Fabi's doing is saying, that's fine, I don't need b4 to play c5. c5 is really the important move instead of b4. And once I play c5, I'm going to have a ton of extra squares for my pieces. And this is the main plan in this position for the white pieces here. This has been tried quite a number of times actually, and pretty much all the time they go for this plan with c5 in high-level games. So we see bishop d7, this knight comes up to e4, bishop back to c7, and now we do see this move c5 come on the board. And this looks like a very loose-looking move, right? You kind of shove this pawn out there, and all of a sudden, neither of these pawns can really support this c5 pawn anymore. So you might think that this pawn is going to be a really big weakness, and you're not wrong. But what white is saying is almost that he would rather not have this pawn than have this pawn at all. And the reason for that is because once this c4 pawn disappears, once this pawn is off the board, all of white's pieces start to make a lot more sense. And we'll see how Fabi proved that in this game. He starts with c5, and now black plays a slightly strange looking move, rook a6. This move is aimed at guarding the d6 square a little bit, guarding the b6 square a little bit, and just kind of clearing the way for an eventual b6 at a later date. This is what Leinier wants to do. Now we see knight fd2 by white. Of course, aiming for the c4 square. This is the square vacated by the pawn, and so this is the first piece to benefit from the removal of this pawn. This knight coming to c4. Knight fd2, though, is actually going to be a pawn sacrifice. Knight fd2 is willingly sacrificing the c5 pawn after the move f5. The reason is, when you put this knight on d2, you took away this knight's only retreating square, and that leaves this knight with exactly one square to go to. It has to jump to d6, and from there, Leinier does in fact snatch this pawn. So now the c-pawn is off the board. Leinier is happy because he has an extra pawn. Fabi is happy because this gives his pieces the opportunity to get really active. Now, all of a sudden, this rook is on a well-placed square guarding or attacking a backwards pawn on a half-open file. This bishop is on the best diagonal it can be on, attacking this b7 pawn, and for the moment, sitting there unopposed. This knight is coming into the best square possible on c4, where it can eye squares like e5, squares like b6. This queen is coming out to b3 on this exact move, all of a sudden attacking this e6 pawn. And we'll see this rook, it is well placed on c1, but it's going to get even more well placed now that the c-pawn is gone, coming to c5 actually immediately after the move queen b8. Queen b3, of course, attack this pawn, and now queen b8, rook c5. So every single one of Fabiano Caruana's pieces is kind of functioning at maximum capacity here. This is as active as his pieces can get. So after rook c5, black went ahead and played king h7, stepping out of this pin, stepping out of these threats as well. And now Fabi just brings this knight in to c4. And like I said, all of his pieces functioning at maximum capacity. Queen a7 hits this rook on c5, so the rook steps over to b5, hitting this b7 pawn. And now, while Fabi's pieces are well placed, at the end of the day, Leinier Dominguez is going to be up a pawn, and so he had a little bit of a chance here to try and claim he was ever so slightly better, but he did have to play very accurately in this moment. So of course, with rook b5, Fabi is challenging this pawn on b7, and there was really only one good way to start evicting this rook from its placement here on b5. And that one way is to play the move a4. This gains extra space on this queen side, takes away the vital b3 square from the queen, and if this queen were to retreat, well, now there's a lot of different options for black, one of which is just this move knight a5, revealing a threat on the rook. If this rook moves back, now you might get met with b5, and suddenly all of those nice squares that you put your pieces on are starting to be taken away by black here. This knight can jump into e5, for example, but black is still doing quite all right in this position with his extra pawn. Is it enough for an edge? Maybe, maybe not, but definitely black is very much in the game here. Instead of a4, Leinier came up with this move, knight d8. And this looks like it does the same. It defends the b7 pawn and attacks this rook. And probably Leinier expected Fabi to just play a move like rook to e5. Just kind of admitting, okay, you attacked my rook, I'll move out of the way. Instead, though, Fabi came up with a really, really nice move here. So I'll let you guys at home take a second to try to find it. Go ahead, pause the video if you would like, but I'm going to reveal it now. The move, of course, is the move a4. This is really, an incredible move by Fabi here. The point is, if you do capture this rook, a takes b5, and all of a sudden, this rook is left with absolutely no squares to jump to. So, bishop c6 instead, queen over to a3, hits a rook on f8, so king f8 gets played. And now, Fabi has kind of his choice of really great moves. He can jump this queen into e7, he chooses knight e5 instead. Now takes on g2, king takes g2. b6 tries to keep the queen out of e7, but that's okay. We have another square available, and that is the square on d6. So queen d6, now queen b7 check, and Fabi just plays king back to g1. In hindsight, the move f3 might have been a little bit more practical in this case, rather than allowing all these holes in your position. f3 makes a new weakness on e3, but it is pretty relevant to have some light square defense here. King g1 instead, rook e8. And now Fabi kind of makes a move that, despite his pretty nice play so far, kind of throws away the advantage if Leinier Dominguez plays accurately. Of course, best here was actually the simple move. You just take a free pawn on d4. Instead, Fabi plays knight to c4, and now Leinier does find the best move, knight f7, queen takes d4, and suddenly after knight g5, you start to realize that you do have some weaknesses around your king, and they're not so easy to defend. This f3 square is pretty brutal. And just for comparison, if Fabi had played f3 here, and let's say rook e8, just the same as we just saw, knight to g5, well, now he would have a ton more options, including the move played in the game, just knight back to e5. This king staying on g2 does defend these light squares a little bit better. Okay, though. So we have knight g5, and now in this case, knight e5 is the only move for Fabi. Knight h3 check still comes on the board, king f1. And now Leinier did miss his chance to kind of have a lot of compensation here. He could have played the move queen h1 check, and then either queen takes h2 or just queen back to g2, keeping an eye on the light squares. And with pressure on the f2 pawn, pressure around this king, this is definite compensation for black here. I'm saying compensation like Leinier is down massive amounts of material. He's not yet, but these queenside pawns are in fact just going to die in the near future, given enough time. So that's why it kind of feels like black is kind of playing with desperation here, trying to get at this white king before everything collapses. And so the engine says this is about equal. Practically, I might even prefer to be black here, just because this white king is looking so dangerous out here in the open. Instead, though, Leinier plays the move rook a to a8, and now Fabi plays the best move. You at home might want to try to find this one for yourself. It shows great practical understanding by Fabiano Caruana. It's a move that really solidifies your king and just almost immediately crushes all hopes of an attack against this guy. Of course, that move is the move f3, the move I've been talking about for a while now. f3 cuts off this queen from invading on the king's side, and now the king can come back to g2, and it's just a much more solid setup for white. Black tried rook a to d8, but this was a little bit too friendly now, giving up this b pawn immediately, and this is just busted now for Leinier. Queen a8 played in the game, rook takes a5, queen over to c8. Of course, at this point, Leinier down to just like 10 seconds. So all of this just kind of time pressure. Rook back to c5, queen a8, queen c6, queen b8, desperately trying to avoid the queen trade. And eventually knight c6 by Fabi, rook up to d6, king up to g2, knight g5, h4, bullies this knight a little bit, knight f7, d4. And now at the end of the day, Fabi is just up 2 passed pawns on this queen side. His king is safe, this knight has been ejected, and all of his pieces are better than all of black's pieces. What more can you ask for? King h7, a5, rook over to c8, rook e to c1, rook up to c7, b4, and now g5. Just kind of a last-ditch effort trying to get this knight back into the game, but Fabi just pushes these pawns even further. Rook g7, queen back to e2, just a little bit of defense, queen over to g8, queen up to e5, knight f7, queen f4, and now queen a8, giving up on the attack. And once black gives up on the attack, he kind of gives up on the game. b5 is played, rook d7, d5, Fabi pushes every one of his pawns, knight g5, d takes e6, knight takes e6, queen f5 check, rook g6, knight e5, and the end is near. Rook d2 check, king f1. And in this position, Leinier Dominguez went ahead and resigned. So that is it for me today on Game Review. Hopefully you enjoyed this game from Fabiano Caruana, really highlighting this nice idea in the reverse Benoni of playing c5, giving your pieces some activity, and then how to play with that activity to convert into a win. Hopefully you enjoyed. That's it for me today, and I will see you next time on Game Review.